This was an execution-style killing when the victim was sleeping. This was her estranged husband of 3 years who stalked her over the course of months when she tried to leave and then executed her 2 days before she planned to move away to Montpelier to get away from him.
Carol Peters and Cheryl Peters' lives began in two vastly different worlds that eventually collided in a tragic and violent end. To understand how such a story unfolded, we must first examine the people they were before their lives became intertwined. Carol Peters was born in a small, rural community in Vermont. He grew up with traditional values, a product of his environment, where he learned the importance of hard work and discipline. He was known in his community as a straightforward, no-nonsense individual. His family ran a small business, which instilled in him the desire to become self-sufficient from a young age. He eventually established his own land surveying business in Morrisville, Vermont, where he earned a solid reputation as a skilled professional. Carol's reserved demeanor made him somewhat of an enigma, but those who worked with him knew him to be reliable and methodical. He lived quietly, keeping to himself outside of work. Cheryl Peters, on the other hand, was raised in a more lively, socially connected household. She had a warm and caring nature that drew people to her. Born in 1951, Cheryl grew up with a strong sense of community and family values. By all accounts, she was someone who placed the needs of others before her own and had a nurturing spirit. Cheryl married young and had 5 children from her previous marriage before meeting Carol. She worked hard to provide for her children and ensure they had a stable upbringing despite the challenges she faced as a single mother. When Cheryl met Carol in the late 1980s, she was seeking stability after a tumultuous period in her life. She had endured the difficulties of raising her children alone and was hoping for a partner who would bring security and balance into her life. Carol, though somewhat introverted, presented himself as someone who could offer that stability. Their relationship moved quickly, and by 1990, the two were married. The early years of Carol and Cheryl Peters' marriage seemed promising from the outside. After marrying in July 1990, they settled into a quiet life in Morrisville, Vermont. Carol continued to run his land surveying business, while Cheryl focused on raising her 5 children from a previous marriage. For Cheryl, this marriage was meant to be a new chapter, a fresh start after a difficult period as a single mother. But beneath the surface, things were far from stable. As their marriage progressed, it became clear that Carol's controlling nature was intensifying. Cheryl's independence and social connections were points of contention in their relationship. Carol, though introverted and reserved, began showing signs of possessiveness that strained their union. He frequently wanted to know Cheryl's whereabouts, monitored her activities, and expressed jealousy over her relationships outside of the marriage. This behavior escalated to the point where it became emotionally suffocating for Cheryl, who had endured enough challenges as a single mother and was hoping for a more peaceful life. By January 1993, just 3 years after their wedding, the tension between them had reached a breaking point. Cheryl, exhausted by the growing control and emotional strain, decided to separate from Carol. She moved out of their shared home, hoping to distance herself from the emotional toll their relationship had taken on her. Cheryl's decision to leave wasn't just a step toward independence. It was an act of self-preservation, as she feared the growing intensity of Carol's behavior. For Carol, the separation was not something he was willing to accept. As the months passed following their official separation in January 1993, Carol's inability to accept the end of their marriage became more apparent. Cheryl had hoped that distancing herself physically from Carol would allow her to regain a sense of normalcy, but Carol's behavior grew increasingly alarming. He seemed unwilling to let go of the life they had built together, despite its broken foundation. The separation wasn't just a matter of emotional struggle for Carol. It was a blow to his control over the relationship. Having always maintained a certain level of dominance in their marriage, the idea that Cheryl was carving out a life without him was something he couldn't tolerate. Reports from those close to Cheryl indicated that Carol's obsessive tendencies became more pronounced after their separation. He followed Cheryl, sometimes sitting outside her new home, and constantly tried to insert himself into her daily life, despite the legal and emotional distance she was trying to establish. Cheryl's children, who had lived through the emotional strain their mother endured during the marriage, were especially concerned about Carol's increasingly erratic behavior. They noticed the subtle yet threatening ways Carol remained present in Cheryl's life, even after she had moved out. Cheryl herself became increasingly fearful, but like many women in such situations, she tried to manage the situation on her own, hoping that Carol's fixation would fade with time. However, it became clear that Carol's obsessive behavior was only escalating. His control, once exerted within the boundaries of their marriage, had turned into a dangerous fixation. Despite the separation, Carol seemed to view Cheryl's independence as a challenge to his authority, something that he could not accept. For Cheryl, this meant living in a constant state of anxiety, unsure of what Carol might do next. But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask for a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensures you don't miss out on any new videos. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the case. By the summer of 1993, the tension between Carol and Cheryl had reached a fever pitch. While Carol continued to run his land surveying business with an outward facade of calm, those who knew the couple could sense that the situation was far from resolved. On the surface, Carol appeared to be a man who had moved on, a professional focused on his work, detached from his past. But behind the carefully constructed mask of normalcy, a darker truth was brewing. Those close to Cheryl had seen the signs, his refusal to let go, his increasing desperation with each passing day. Then came the night of September 2nd, 1993. It was a night that would forever shatter the lives of Cheryl's loved ones and cast a long shadow over the small, tight-knit community of Morrisville, Vermont. Cheryl's life came to an abrupt, violent end, a chilling, calculated murder that left the town in shock. That night, Cheryl was found lying on her couch, her body unnervingly still, her home disturbingly quiet. She had been shot in the head, execution style, as she slept. It was a brutal and cold-blooded killing, and for those who had been worried about her safety, the tragedy confirmed their worst fears. The quiet dread they had lived with had now become a horrifying reality. The family's nightmare had materialized in the most unimaginable way. The crime scene told a story, a terrifying one. Cheryl had been shot with unnerving precision, with a level of planning that suggested she had been watched, perhaps for days or even weeks, by someone who knew her every move. Her body was discovered in a position that indicated no struggle. It was as if she had been unaware of the danger that lurked so close to her, making the attack all the more chilling. This was no random act of violence. This was not the result of a botched burglary or a home invasion gone wrong. This was deliberate, personal, and filled with rage. Who could carry out such a calculated crime? That question echoed through the minds of investigators as they combed through the evidence. Suspicion immediately fell on one man, Carol Peters. The method of the murder, the fact that Cheryl was killed in the privacy of her own home while she slept, pointed to someone close to her. Someone who knew her habits, her routines, and someone who had a deeply personal motive. It didn't take long for the Vermont State Police and local authorities to focus their investigation on Carol, Cheryl's estranged husband. Their troubled history, the reports of Carol's obsessive behavior, the stalking allegations, it all pointed in one direction. But there was a problem. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, the legal system demands proof. Investigators could sense that Carol was involved. Everything about the case screamed it. But their suspicions alone weren't enough. They needed something concrete, a murder weapon, a damning piece of evidence that could tie him directly to the crime. But none of that was immediately forthcoming. The lack of a clear link left law enforcement in a frustrating limbo. For Cheryl's family, particularly her 5 children, there was no doubt in their minds who was responsible. They had witnessed their mother's emotional decline as Carol's behavior became more erratic and unhinged. She had confided in them, expressed her growing fear of Carol, and described his obsessive stalking in chilling detail. To them, Cheryl's murder was the horrifying climax of Carol's escalating control. But the investigators faced a challenge, one that felt insurmountable. Their suspicions, though strong, were not enough. Without concrete evidence, the legal system's wheels turned slowly. Carol, ever the enigma, maintained his innocence, never letting his guard down, always careful with his words. Months passed. The case, once urgent, began to grow colder. Investigators continued their efforts, combing through every lead, re-examining every piece of evidence, but the elusive key that could unlock the mystery remained out of reach. It was as if the town was caught in a state of suspended grief, waiting for answers that never came. Meanwhile, Carol continued living his life, presenting himself as the grieving, wronged man. But beneath the surface, the community whispered. They speculated, they suspected, but nothing could be done. The brutal murder had shaken Morrisville to its core, and yet there was no resolution in sight. The unease lingered like a dark cloud, hovering over the town, refusing to dissipate. Would justice ever be served, or would Cheryl's killer walk free forever? For Cheryl's children, the grief they carried was almost unbearable. The loss of their mother, in such a violent and horrifying way, was a wound that would never truly heal. But what made their anguish even more excruciating was the sense that justice, the one thing that could bring some measure of closure, was nowhere in sight. Days turned into months, and months into years, with no one being held accountable for their mother's murder. The frustration mounted, layer upon layer, as time marched on and the case grew colder. From the very beginning, Cheryl's children had been convinced of one thing: Carol Peters was responsible. They had witnessed firsthand the toxic dynamic between him and their mother. They had seen how his behavior shifted from subtle control to outright obsession. Cheryl had confided in them, sharing her fears, her sense of being watched, of Carol's constant oppressive presence. To them, the idea that anyone other than Carol had committed the murder was unimaginable. But the reality they faced was harsh. The investigation seemed to be stalled, and no charges were brought against Carol. How could they move on when the person they believed to be responsible was walking free, continuing with his life as if nothing had happened? Their sense of powerlessness was overwhelming. Desperate for justice in any form, Cheryl's children took matters into their own hands. In 1996, 3 years after their mother's murder, they pursued a civil case against Carol, filing a wrongful death lawsuit. This was their way of fighting back, their attempt to bring Carol to account for the nightmare they had been living through since that tragic night in 1993. But even in this pursuit of justice, the system seemed to work against them. The wrongful death claim was dismissed due to the statute of limitations, a legal technicality that felt like yet another blow. It was as if the doors to justice were being shut one by one, leaving them out in the cold. However, there was a glimmer of vindication. The jury did find Carol guilty of sexual assault and battery, claims that Cheryl's children had hoped would at least reveal some of the darkness lurking behind his public facade. The civil court awarded Cheryl's estate $605,000 in damages. It was a small semblance of justice, a monetary figure that could never fill the void left by Cheryl's death, or answer the ultimate question that haunted her family: who had really killed Cheryl Peters? The court's ruling, though significant, was far from the resolution they had sought. In their hearts, the children believed they knew who was responsible, but the criminal justice system had yet to make that determination. The case remained open, the answers just out of reach, as the years continued to pass by. For Cheryl's family, the $605,000 wasn't closure. It was merely a reminder of everything they had lost. The money couldn't bring back their mother, it couldn't erase the pain, and it certainly couldn't provide the peace of knowing that the person responsible for her death had been brought to justice. The nagging question that haunted them all still lingered, unanswered and unresolved. Who killed Cheryl Peters? And more importantly, would they ever see true justice for their mother's murder? Carroll, for his part, remained a fixture in the community. He continued to live in Morrisville, running his land surveying business and maintaining a low profile. Despite the suspicions that swirled around him, he managed to live without criminal repercussions, all while the dark shadow of the unresolved murder loomed over the town. His presence, a constant reminder of the unsolved case, added to the tension in the community. Yet, there were no new developments, and the case remained cold for nearly 3 decades. Behind the scenes, the authorities hadn't forgotten about Cheryl's murder. Though no progress was being reported publicly, cold case investigators quietly continued to work on the case, reviewing evidence and re-examining the details of the original investigation. Over the years, techniques in forensic analysis improved, and the investigators hoped that new methods would eventually help crack the case. However, for the time being, the case of Cheryl Peters remained an unresolved mystery. After nearly 3 decades of frustration, a significant breakthrough finally came in 2024. The case, which had long been considered a cold case, gained renewed attention when 2 cold case investigators took a closer look at the evidence. Advances in forensic technology and investigative methods played a role in revisiting old leads, and the persistence of the authorities began to pay off. In a surprising development, a Lemuel County grand jury was convened to review the evidence against Cheryl Peters. This was a rare procedural move, as grand juries are seldom used in Vermont, but in this instance it became the key to moving the case forward. After hearing the evidence presented by the prosecutors, the grand jury returned an indictment against Cheryl Peters, charging him with first-degree murder for the 1993 killing of Cheryl Peters. On September 19, 2024, Vermont State Police, in conjunction with the Morristown Police Department, arrested Cheryl Peters at his home. At 70 years old, Cheryl was taken into custody and charged with the murder of his estranged wife. He was held without bail at the St. Johnsbury prison and appeared in court via video for his arraignment. During the arraignment, prosecutors described the murder as an execution-style killing, with Cheryl being shot in the head while she was sleeping. They argued that Cheryl had stalked and harassed Cheryl for months after their separation, unable to accept her desire to move on from their relationship. The prosecutor, Lemuel County State's Attorney Aliena Gerhard, emphasized the deliberate and premeditated nature of the crime, painting a picture of Cheryl as a controlling and obsessive man who couldn't handle the rejection. Carroll's defense attorney, Kirk Williams, argued that there was no direct evidence tying his client to the crime, and that the prosecution's case was built on speculation and circumstantial evidence. However, the judge sided with the prosecution, ordering Carroll to remain in custody without bail while the case proceeded. For Cheryl's family, the indictment brought a long-awaited sense of justice. After 31 years of waiting, they finally saw the man they believed responsible for her death being charged. The legal process had only just begun, and there is still much to uncover as the case moves forward. If you'd like to stay updated on this case and other similar stories, make sure to subscribe and press the bell icon to never miss an update. We also encourage you to like, share, and comment your thoughts on this case. Do you think justice is finally being served after all these years? What are your thoughts on cold cases taking decades to solve? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you haven't already, check out our recent videos appearing on the screen, where we cover more unsolved mysteries and the shocking resolutions that followed. Thank you for watching.